Hello everybody, it's HiroTheJapaneseTrain here, and welcome to the first episode of my brand new series called Thomasified. As many of you know, I'm something of a history buff. In fact, that's pretty much my entire career. I'm a world history teacher, and being paid to yammer at people about my favorite historical facts is honestly the most fulfilling thing ever. And when I'm not lesson planning, or grading papers, or thinking about the next weird historical meme I could torture my students with, I'm thinking about the Thomas universe. Any Thomas fan will know that the world Audrey created is actually very closely tied to many real-life places, often real engines, and real historical events. The Thomas universe is basically just the authentic history of the world with some new island tossed in off the coast of England. So, there's a natural relationship between liking Thomas and liking history for me. I was very inspired by the world Audrey created from a very young age, and in particular, I am fond of the book The Island of Sodor, Its People, History, and Railways. Audrey went out of his way to write a history of the island of Sodor, going all the way back to the Middle Ages in a children's book series about talking trains. That's insanely deep lore, and just the kind of crazy attention to historical detail that I really get excited by. Alright, I've padded the runtime of this enough. Let's talk about what this series is and who it's going to be about. My vision for the Thomas universe is that every vehicle bigger than, I guess, a lawnmower, maybe a bicycle, pretty much anything bigger than that, should be considered sentient. So if we were going to go back in world history, technically all those Roman chariots, Greek trireme warships, and even carts straight out of ancient Mesopotamia would all have faces, personalities, and stories. So that's what this series is about. I'm going to take historical vehicles from long before the invention of steam, and I'm going to, Thomasify them. So sit back and relax as we go way back in time and uncover the answers to today's question. What was the oldest vehicle that we can Thomasify? And what could have been the earliest possible vehicle to exist on the island of Sodor? For the purposes of this video, I will focus on land-based wheeled vehicles and also the oldest boats, since Sodor is obviously an island after all. According to the Reverend Wilbert Audrey, Sudrians have a blend of ancestry from Celtic, Scandinavian, Scots, and English, specifically Cumbrian roots. Using the nearby regions of the British Isles, we can piece together when the first settlers likely arrived on the island of Sodor, and therefore when the first vehicles, aka boats, would have touched the island's shores. The nearby Isle of Man was settled in a period known as the Mesolithic, basically just before the period called the Neolithic, aka the New Stone Age, where we saw the dawn of agriculture. This means the Isle of Man was settled anywhere from 6,500 to 8,000 years ago. We can assume the first human settlements on Sodor occurred roughly at the same time. The oldest known boat in recorded history is the Pesse canoe, a dugout canoe found in the Netherlands. And a dugout canoe is basically a log that's been burrowed into so that someone could sit and then use it as kind of a boat, Although these are mostly used for sailing along creeks and lakes, you can imagine some intrepid explorers would have used something like this to get to Sodor thousands of years ago. In fact, these kinds of canoes are likely how settlers went all over the British Isles and Northern Europe. I will call this first canoe that landed on the Sudrian shores Moelmo. Why Moelmo? Well, I just straight up used a caveman name generator, and this is the one that sounded coolest, so. Moelmo came from a log that was felled from a tree near what would become the modern town of Barrow-in-Furness. The tribesman that built her, whose name was Brusca, would awake every morning and stare out across the rocky beaches, gazing in awe at the island just across the waves. As an energetic young boy, he had tried to swim across the channel to reach what we know as the island of Sodor. However, his mother would not let him go. The tribes had sent an expedition to fish near the island many moons before, and all of the men who sailed, including Brusca's father, were annihilated in a storm. The tribe shaman warned that it was the will of the spirits that the tribe venture no further. Brusca wasn't going to take no for an answer. After all, he wanted to see the world. And to this tribesman, that island was the whole world. When he grew to the ripe age of 20, geriatric by ancient standards, he finally decided that he would take matters into his own hands. Using his handcraft stone tools, he chopped down a tree and began carving. He carved day and night for over a week, and finally, his creation took shape. Moelmo is primitive by our standards, but state-of-the-art to Brusca. Her edges were rough, and she was full of splinters, but she took to the water nicely. She could reach great speeds zipping across the lakes that he tested her on. Moelmo was a happy craft, who made quiet happy giggles as she bobbed over the waves. She was Brusca's pride and joy. But he had to keep her a secret, just long enough until he could go out on his own. He hid Moelmo amongst a stack of other branches, logs, and tree trunks. Then, Brusca ran home to fetch supplies. They would leave the following night. At least that's what the plan was. However, fortune would become the catalyst for Brusca's brave journey. The night sky suddenly lit up with orange flames. An attack was underway. A rival tribe, starving but fueled by adrenaline, stormed in and began looting. Brusca's fellow men were cut down in large numbers by dagger and spear. Brusca knew it was now or never. He grabbed what meager tools and food he could carry and fled his tent. The survivors among the tribe began running for the sea, as they had no more options. The invaders set fire to the trees, and the blaze was out of control. Brusca had to run into the inferno if there was any hope that he could reach Moelmo. Brusca's chest heaved as he ran to the spot where he had left Moelmo behind. Smoke filled the air. Moelmo was surrounded by flames that began to lap at her splinters, wanting to devour her. Brusca had to lift logs out of the way that were already black and charred. He struggled to lift up the heaviest logs, as they seemed just to pin the boat down even more. An invader spotted Brusca and ran straight for him. Brusca was already out of breath, the pure adrenaline of the moment sustaining him. Brusca dove at a branch, looked up, and struck the invader in the legs. He then took the man's spear and finished him off with it. Using the spear as a crowbar of sorts, Brusca finally got Moelmo loose. Moelmo's face made a large and hopeful grin. Moelmo felt the stones and dirt scratch at her as Brusca dragged her to the water. By then, the survivors were doing their best to fight the enemy tribe, but could not hold out much longer. Brusca tossed Moelmo in the water with a mighty splash. Using the spear as an oar, he was just about to paddle away. Just then, he looked back behind him and saw all of his helpless tribesmen and women. Brusca sighed, dropped his head, and turned Moelmo around to go back to shore. He waved his arms frantically and took some survivors aboard. Nearly 6 people in total inhabited his vessel. Others began tossing log after log into the water and holding on for dear life as they tried to use them as rafts. Brusca stood and paddled Moelmo to the front of the pack. He led nearly 100 people across the channel that night, and Moelmo was the first vehicle to ever touch Sodor's shores. A wave of relief came over her when she felt the grainy sand tickle her bow. It meant that her creator was safe. Moelmo was Brusca's trusted companion for many years after that. They fished and hunted together, exploring the many waterways of Sodor's interior. Brusca rose to become chieftain of his tribe. Upon his death, as was the practice at the time, he was buried in a peat bog with all of his possessions, including Moelmo, where she remains to this day. The bog, however, where this ancient site was, has yet to be discovered. I'm just realizing that a Moelmo custom would be really freaking easy. I have no excuse not making one in a future video. So this is my creation for what would have been the very first vehicle to touch the island of Sodor. But what about the first ever vehicle with wheels? For that, we actually have to fast forward pretty far from Moelmo's day. The earliest recorded complete wagon in the world comes from Armenia in the Lusatian region.
Bless you.
It was found when the Soviets were draining a lake in the 1950s and discovered the wagon along with over 800 tombs. Just look how ridiculously old looking this thing is, with those ginormous wooden wheels. It's like one of those Flintstone cars, but in real life. Apparently there were almost a dozen other wagons found that were all in greatly preserved condition. These wagons date back to the 2000s BCE, which is much more recent than Moelmo would have been. It was believed these wagons were part of a funeral ritual to help a deceased powerful person receive a good passage to the afterlife. Now, we're talking about Armenia, so that's a completely different culture than that which would have existed on Sodor. However, the closest artifact we have to this wagon in Britain is a single wheel from the Must Farm, referred to as Britain's Pompeii, because there are so many complete preserved artifacts, down to some of the meals they ate. This wheel came from what was probably a cart, which may have been pulled by horses. Okay, I think I have everything I need. Let's get down to the story. Our story begins in between the modern towns of Wellsworth and Merrin, which is today part of the Northwestern Railway's main line. 3,000 years ago, however, this was the site of a long-forgotten culture on the island who settled at the base of what today is called Gordon's Hill. At the top of the hill, a shrine was built for the various gods of this culture's polytheistic mythology. Offerings and sacrifices were made at the top of the hill to provide well wishes for a good harvest and to keep favor of the gods. The top of the hill was also home to the burial plots, where chieftains and others at the top of the social hierarchy were to be buried with honors, including all of their belongings, animals, and even wives. To build the shrine was tough and arduous work. The priests calculated the movements of the sun and the moon to select the spot. Workers had to fell trees and drag the logs uphill, along with their supplies. To make the journey easier, the settlement's carpenters created their first wagon. He had massive wooden wheels and a long pole coming out of the front of him to be coupled up to the harnesses of cattle, as horses were incredibly rare on the British Isles in this period. A ceremony that night was held to thank the gods for the inspiration to build such an impressive wagon. He was given a name. Let's see. I love it. Carr. A blood sacrifice was made by slaughtering a pig, and a feast was held in his honor. The chieftain admired the craft and made Carr his personal cart. Unfortunately, being the eldest sibling and receiving such honors made Carr too big for his wheels. Carr worked all day carrying supplies up the hill in the morning and bringing the workers down in the evening. More carts were built to accompany Carr. The chieftain personally rode up on Carr every morning and demanded that his horses be used to pull Carr. The other carts in the settlement were pulled by cattle. Carr would regularly brag to the other carts that he was the chieftain's favorite. The chieftain would challenge the other carts to races and would always win. Before long, Carr was taken off of pulling supplies and would only carry the chieftain's favorite wives and his children around as something of a royal carriage. Carr gave rides at festivals, he traveled to the seaside for fishing expeditions, and he was always the top priority for replacement parts when needed. The shrine was nearing completion. It had taken many months to erect the structure. Some of the builders had concerns about the shrine's supports. The shrine was wooden, and therefore not as strong as something like Stonehenge. One strong storm could make it all come crashing down. And that's when it began. Like a prophecy, a storm raged one night. Lightning flashed and thunder roared. The wooden structure began to lose its strength. One beam fell, followed by another, and then the entire structure came down with it. The villagers woke up the next day with their hearts in their stomachs. The priests believed the gods were displeased with their work and demanded a stronger structure at once. The chieftain came to Carr that morning. "Good morning, chief. Where shall we go today? Down to the sea? Shall we make offerings in the forest?"
"No," the chief said bluntly. "The shrine fell down. We must go and work today."
Carr furrowed his brow.
"Work? With those stinky cattle carts? No. I left that life behind many moons ago." "It is the will of the gods. Come along."
The chieftain climbed in the seat, and they were off.
Carr grumbled all the way to the forest to collect more logs. The other carts snickered and whispered to themselves. One spoke to Carr. Not so fancy anymore, are we? That's right, you'll be a hard worker once again. Carr said nothing. He was determined to have a breakdown when they reached the hill. Then he would get out of having to do work. Workers stacked logs high in Carr's compartment. Too high, and Carr knew this. The horses strained as Carr climbed the hill. The chieftain roared at the horses, cracking his whip. Come on, Carr! Heave! The chieftain yelled. Hold back! Hold back! Carr told himself. He heard his wooden axles creak and groan. With a loud snap, his axle broke. Carr sank down to one side. The chieftain nearly fell off. It might have been better if he did. The horses broke free from the harness. Now Carr was weighed down only by the logs. Carr roared down the hill with the chieftain still in the seat. The chieftain wanted to save his favorite cart, trying everything he could to slow Carr down, but it was no use. Carr roared through the village and slammed into a stone wall. The dust settled. Workers ran to the site of the disaster. Carr was in pieces. The horses weren't hurt, but had to be tracked down. However, the chieftain had it worst of all. He had been thrown from the cart, smacked the wall, and landed amongst Carr's debris. The chieftain was dead. In proving his point, Carr had just killed the ruler of the village. Because Carr was the chieftain's favorite, he was repaired in quick time. The chieftain's oldest son became the new ruler. For a brief moment, Carr felt pleased with himself. He smirked as he was hooked up to the horses once again. All of the other carts giggled to one another. Carr was confused. But then, the body of the chieftain was loaded onto Carr. It was then that Carr knew he was in trouble. Carr was brought to the top of the hill with a dead chieftain in tow. He was driven to a ramp which led to a large hole in the ground. The horses dutifully followed their leads down to the pit. A sacrifice was made. The horses, highly valued commodity, were sacrificed to the gods and left standing upright. Then, the pit was filled with dirt. Carr was buried at the top of the hill. The other carts dutifully finished the shrine in record time. They all warned one another about the big hill, and told the younger carts the story of Carr, the most troublesome cart of them all. Carr's burial plot has yet to be discovered as well, but it lies very close to the rails on Gordon's Hill. One can assume that Carr remains under the ground, just waiting for some inquisitive construction worker to stumble upon this wondrous ancient piece of Sudrian history. And there you have it. These stories are obviously just made up, but I tried my best to write ancient short stories in the spirit of Audrey's writings. It doesn't get much older than this when we talk about sentient vehicles, and it really was a challenge to stretch my creativity with stories thousands of years before the more modern vehicles that we're used to. Let me know what you think of Moelmo and Carr, and let me know what other historical time periods I should cover in my next episode. Thank you very much for watching and supporting this new series. I'm HiroTheJapaneseTrain, signing off. I'll see you in the next one.